All right, welcome everybody. I'm Peter Gordon. I'm one of the co-chairs of Harvard's Colloquium for Intellectual History, and we sponsor a series of events in fall and spring every year. And this is a really stimulating occasion for our major spring event, a panel on refugee intellectuals and their challenges, we can say, both with the challenge of migration and the sometimes uncertain welcome that they received at Harvard University itself. This is, of course, not just a problem of Harvard. It's a challenge in the world today because we're a world of migration. We're a world where people coming from war-torn regions around the world often find themselves the objects of fear, persecution, or uncertain welcome. So the panel has a title which reflects that, Refugees Not Welcome, European exile scholars at Harvard in the 1930s and 40s. And I should note that this was a panel organized chiefly due to the initiative of Irina Mikhailova, who's here at the end and will be speaking as well. So we have three speakers, and I shouldn't take up any of your time. I will just say that there are three speakers. Laurel Leff, who is a professor of journalism and associate director of Jewish studies at Northeastern University here in Boston. The second speaker will be Irina Mikhailova, who's the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Department of History at Harvard and Department of Philosophy and Cultural Heritage at the University of Venice in Italy. And then third, Sebastian Musch, who is Alfred Landecker Lecturer at the Department of History and the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies at Osnabrück University. And this year, I'm happy to report that he's here with us at Harvard. He's the Starr Fellow in the Center for Jewish Studies. So the speakers will go in that order, and I'm just delighted to welcome the first, Laurel Leff, and she'll speak from the podium. I'll just sit down here from now on. Laurel.
Hi, so I have to lower this. Can everybody hear me okay? Is it sound working good? Okay, good. So I was really delighted when Irina messaged me and said that she wanted to do a panel on this subject. There's just a tremendous amount written about the intellectual migration, but not very much about how the scholars got from there to here. And even less on American universities' role in having that happen or not happen. And it's particularly wonderful that Irina was willing to take this on in terms of an institution that she's currently at and having the panel at that particular institution. I think that makes it even more special. So thank you very much for doing this. Before we get to Harvard, and I will be spending most of my time talking about Harvard, I did want to give a little bit of an overview of why American universities were so important in rescuing scholars. So in the 1920s, the United States moved from a basically open immigration system, with the important exception of the Chinese, who were banned entirely, to one that was extremely restrictive. And for the first time, there was a quota that was imposed on the number of immigrants who could come to the United States. It was 159,000 a year. And it was also imposed that there would be country-by-country quotas, including 25,957 who were allowed to come to the United States from Germany. Now, that was more than any other country besides Great Britain. And just to give you some contrast, Poland's limit was 700, so it really was a lot more from Germany. But it was nowhere near enough after the Nazis assumed power in January of 1933. And then on top of that, on top of the numerical limit, first the Hoover administration and then the Roosevelt administration used administrative discretion to limit immigration even further, ensuring that through almost the entirety of this period, the quotas weren't even filled. So you were talking about a very small path to legal quota immigration. But there was another part of the immigration law that provided for what were called non-quota visas. There was no limit on a non-quota visa. Most people who got non-quota visas were either from the Western Hemisphere or were the parents, children, or spouses of American citizens. But there was also a provision, it was Section 4D of the Immigration Act of 1924, that allowed those who for 2 years prior to immigration had been carrying on the vocation of minister or professor at an institution of higher learning, and who sought to enter the United States to continue carrying on that vocation could get a non-quota visa, or at least qualified for one. It certainly didn't guarantee that you would get one. And it also enabled your wife, and they did in fact mean wife, and unmarried children under the age of 18 to also get non-quota visas. Now, the State Department interpreted this provision to require applicants for non-quota visas to have an offer from an American university to prove that they were going to be carrying on the vocation of professor when they came to the United States. So that's the key part of it that transformed American universities into being very important in this migration process. Refugee advocates, as soon as this started happening in Germany and when Hitler assumed chancellorship in January of 1933, recognized the importance of this aspect of the immigration law. So the primary committee, and I'm going to refer to this a couple of times, which was called the Emergency Committee in Aid of Displaced, first German scholars, and then it became foreign scholars. But this was formed in May 1933. And they decided that they weren't going to place scholars. They were going to wait until universities made job offers. And they would treat it like any other kind of job offer, meaning that a department would assess an applicant, look at their scholarship, look at their teaching, look at their service, decide whether or not they wanted to make an offer. It would then go up through the university, and that would be the way an offer would be made. But the emergency committee's role in this was that they decided that because there was a Great Depression going on, it might be difficult to convince American universities to hire foreign scholars, especially because of budget problems. So what they would do is they would make the offers temporary, so you wouldn't necessarily be competing with American scholars. And the emergency committee would fund half of the amount of the person's salary. And then the other half would either be made up for by the university or through a foundation. And it turned out to be mostly the Rockefeller Foundation that funded these positions. Now, even before Hitler became chancellor, German universities had already begun their purge of Jewish and non-Aryan scholars, often, interestingly, at the demand of their students. Within 3 months of Hitler becoming chancellor at the end of January 1933, it was enacted, the Act for the Restoration of the Civil Service was enacted, and that banned anyone of the Jewish race from holding a government position. And because all universities were state-run, that meant that almost immediately 1,200 German scholars were fired right away. And in the United States, people learned about this fairly quickly. They got letters from colleagues. There were notices put out by various disciplines. It was in the newspapers. And so even at that very early point in the spring of 1933, individual professors, disciplines, other kinds of organizations began the hunt for university positions for these displaced scholars. Now, in doing this, there was one group that was conspicuously absent, and that was university administrations. And the reasons for that might sort of feel familiar to us today, so I'm not going to dwell on them. But one reason was it's always easier to say no than yes, right? So a lot of administrators were not hiring anybody. And this, again, of course, it's during a depression, and there had been fairly serious staff cutbacks at universities at this point, although universities recovered fairly quickly, and many of these positions were funded, as I indicated, but still that provided a convenient excuse. We can't possibly hire another scholar. We don't have the resources for it. And then also it was a dicey political situation. And one that was dicey in both directions. Universities didn't want to look as if they were helping foreigners, especially Jews, at the expense of American scholars. And this was a position that actually the AAUP took, as we didn't want to be hiring foreigners at this point. So that would be on one hand. On the other hand, you didn't want to look as if you were being anti-Semitic or favoring Nazis, especially at institutions that had prominent Jewish alumni. So this was something universities directly didn't want to get involved with. And I think there were some exceptions, but this was relatively true across the nation. So Harvard wasn't alone in what the title of my talk described as its callousness. This was a fairly common position. But still, Harvard does stand out for the reasons Harvard often stands out, which is that no other American institution had the resources or the ability to hire a lot of refugee scholars that Harvard did. At one point, a man named Selig Hecht, who was a Columbia biophysics professor who had received his doctorate from Harvard, wrote Harvard's new president, this would have been of October 1933, and this is what he said. Since coming back from abroad a few weeks ago, it has become painfully apparent to me that Harvard has taken no part in the effort of American learned institutions to provide places for those German scholars, Jewish or otherwise, who have been deprived of their posts by the Nazi government. I am puzzled by this because the two obviously possible reasons, lack of knowledge and lack of funds, do not apply. And Hecht got it right. The president at that time was a man named A. Lawrence Lowell, and he was not willing to participate in the efforts to help displaced scholars. He was the president when Hitler assumed power, and he was asked to be on the board of the emergency committee, and he refused. Many universities were asked as sort of an initial gesture to take $2,000 from the emergency committee to hire a scholar, and he refused to do that. In May of 1933, although this was sub rosa, this was not generally announced, the Harvard Corporation, at Lowell's request, officially decided not to become involved with the emergency committee, unlike Princeton and Stanford and the University of Chicago and dozens of other universities. And privately, Lowell explained his position. He thought that New York Jews were trying to use the college for purposes of propaganda. And he wrote, if we invited anyone, it would be trumpeted all over the country by Jewish organizations that Harvard was calling one of these expelled Jews and that other places ought to do the same. So that was that was one position. James Conant, who became president of Harvard in September of 1933 and was therefore president during most of this period, tried to do a delicate dance. And here we need to give Harvard some credit. So over 12 years, Harvard hired 45 refugee scholars, which was more than any other American university except for the New School for Social Research, which had a very different model. And many of them were researchers, but some of them were actually also added to the faculty. But in almost all of these cases, it was very hard to do. And it was a small number compared to Harvard's size and its resources. And just as one measure of comparison, Caltech had 800 students in 1940. It hired 14 refugee scholars. Harvard hired twice that many, but it had 10 times the number of students. And Conant personally, and he's against the president of Harvard during almost all of this period, had no interest in hiring refugee scholars. I could only find one example of a scholar he pushed. He was a Protestant and not endangered, and in fact was considered a Nazi sympathizer. And he did not accept Harvard's very generous offer. More common in terms of Conant's position was what was going on in his own department, which was chemistry. And he basically opposed hiring any refugee scholars in chemistry. When DuPont Corporation asked him what he thought of Max Bergman in September 1933, Conant wrote, he is certainly very definitely of the Jewish type, rather heavy, as I recall. And then he went on to expand on what he thought of refugee scholars more generally. We shall not help, this is again as Conant, we should not help the cause of American science any by filling up the good positions in this country by imported foreigners. A deluge of medium and good men of the Jewish race in scientific positions would do a lot of harm. Needless to say, do not quote me too widely on any of this. And I'll call your attention to that last phrase, do not quote me too wildly on any of this, to point out that even during this period, Harvard had some prominent Jewish alumni, such as federal judge Julian Mack. It had some, but not very many, Jewish faculty, such as law professor Felix Frankfurter. And as Conant wrote to a lawyer who was a member of the Harvard Corporation, I feel that people outside the university, like Judge Mack, are very apt to mix up charity and education. But of course, I should be the last person to tell him this bluntly. And then Conant reiterated that a large number of the displaced scholars were Jews, and he had not heard of any displaced one whom we could use satisfactorily in the chemistry department. But, and this is, the delicate dance again, Conant wrote in the same letter that he wouldn't necessarily stand in the way of individual departments who wanted to hire scholars. And so if someone came to him, he might be willing to consider. And in fact, during this period, during the first 6 years after the purge of German universities, he sanctioned some hiring of refugee scholars. And that, I think, is due to the efforts of certain members of the Harvard faculty who were very dedicated to trying to bring onto the faculty refugee scholars. And I'm going to focus on three of them. David Etzel, who is dean of the medical school, Carl Friedrich, who was a professor of government, and Harlow Shapley, who was head of the Harvard Observatory, none of whom were, interestingly, themselves Jewish. So we'll start with David Etzel. David Etzel had been dean of the medical school for 15 years in the spring of 1933. And when the word reached Harvard professors about what was happening in Germany, members of the faculty went to him and said, can you solicit the help of President Lowell in trying to organize a committee at Harvard to fund German Jewish professors. This was something that was done at Columbia. It was done at, I think, actually at most of the British universities. Etzel wrote to Lowell, never heard from him, and Etzel actually thought that Lowell was avoiding him. But Etzel did get a chance to help in December 1933 when an offshoot of the emergency committee asked 70 deans of 70 different medical schools whether they would be willing to take on a refugee scholar. And Harvard Medical School was one of 14 of those 70 who expressed a willingness to offer research positions. And there are a couple of things that are striking about Etzel's response. The first is it's almost immediate. He gets the letter and he immediately sends out a letter to all of the heads of the various medical school departments, asking them if they'd be willing to take on a refugee scholar. And he gets 15 who say, yes, they would in fact be willing to hire a refugee scholar. The other thing that's striking about Etzel's response is that he, and this is true, during this entire period, sort of sees this as a mix of merit and humanitarianism. His philosophy, and he writes this, was that Harvard should hire, as a quote, as many as possible of the men, and I should point out all of this is quite sexist, even though some women are involved, who are anywhere from good to excellent quality. That we should not just insist on those who are exceptional or those who fit the university's needs. Although he acknowledged that he knew the university thought differently. So during Etzel's tenure as dean, and it only lasts for 2 more years until 1935 when he retires, the med school hired 5 refugee scholars. And then when he retired, what Etzel did was he devoted himself to trying to help refugee physicians. And in fact, he started a committee in Boston that became a national committee that served 4,500 of the 5,500 refugee physicians who came to the United States and helped to make the physicians the most successful occupational group, as post-war surveys showed. So that's Etzel. And then you have Carl Friedrich, who again is a government professor. And his interest in the issue might be a little bit more obvious. He was born in Germany. He was educated in Germany. He came to the United States in the 1920s before the rise of the Nazi regime. Like Etzel, he did as much outside Harvard as he did inside Harvard, along with David Reisman, who goes on to become a very famous Harvard sociologist, but at that time was an untenured law professor at the University of Buffalo. And they together form a committee to help retrain lawyers and journalists who had been lawyers and journalists in Europe, but in order to practice their profession here needed some retraining. They formed that group. And then he helped in terms of hiring some people onto the Harvard faculty. And I'm just going to give you one example. And I'm going to give you this example not because this person is particularly important or because what Friedrich did was particularly unusual, but I think it will illustrate how hard it was to help just one person. It took a tremendous amount of effort. All of the people who I found in researching this who were American professors who sort of dedicated themselves to this, including David Reisman at Buffalo, it just took over their lives. This is what they spent their years doing. And the one person I'm going to focus on here was a scholar named Fritz Epstein. He was a professor of Slavic history at the University of Frankfurt. He had been fired because of his Jewish origins in 1933. He went to England with a grant for the Academic Assistance Council, which was the British equivalent of the Emergency Committee. And Friedrich, I think, knew him vaguely. They were not in any way good friends. But in May 1936, a woman who worked for the Academic Assistance Council writes to Friedrich and says that, Epstein's grant is about to run out. It's not going to be renewed. He has 2 small children, and that Epstein's wife had told her that a place was being created for Epstein at Harvard. And this is a quote, "They now live by this hope alone." So Friedrich takes up the case. And the first thing he does is he writes lots of letters to anybody who might be able to help. The Emergency Committee, Hoover War Library at Stanford. He writes to other Slavic scholars to get an assessment of Epstein's work. Epstein was then working on a manuscript called Russia and World Politics that was circulating, and most people seem to think highly of his work, with one important exception, which was Friedrich's colleague, Harvard Slavic scholar Samuel Cross. Friedrich had tried to get Epstein as a researcher for Cross. He had considered it all to be smooth sailing. And then Cross went to Berlin. He spoke to a professor there who told him that Epstein was a good bibliographical compiler without much personality. And one thing I just wanted to point out is that oftentimes in assessing the Jewish scholars, personality played a really big role. The Jewish scholars either tended to have not enough of it or too much of it. It seemed to be the common thread there. But Cross then decides that he's not promising enough to justify any heroic efforts in his behalf. So Cross doesn't want Epstein as a research assistant. And in doing so, he disclaims that anti-Semitism is behind this in terms of the negative judgment of Epstein, while revealing it. Cross wrote that his German friend, who didn't think much of Epstein, is not a man to be particularly concerned with Epstein's Jewish background, and observed that in any case, Epstein came from a family which had been converted for some time. But then Cross suggested somebody else for Friedrich to consider. I should very much like to recommend Richard Solomon, who was formerly professor of Eastern European history at Hamburg. Solomon is, of course, a Jew, but an agreeable one. So that will give you a little bit of flavor for that. But Friedrich, is not just too discouraged. He's pretty discouraged, but he's not too discouraged. And he decides that the best thing to do for Epstein is to bring him to the United States and send him on a lecture tour of American universities. And that's what he does. And Friedrich arranges all of this. So Epstein he starts at the Tufts Fletcher School for Law and Diplomacy, then lectures at least 12 universities in the Midwest and West, and Friedrich, probably with the help of a very capable secretary, I assume, sets this all up. Friedrich personally raises money to pay for the expenses the universities aren't willing to pay for, which is most of it. He gets a private grant. And it works. In July 1937, Friedrich is informed that Epstein would be a research assistant for him and for another professor of Russian studies, and would get a $2,000 grant, which is about $44,000 in contemporary money, from the Committee on Research in the Social Sciences at Harvard. And Epstein goes on to have a distinguished career at the Hoover Institution and then as a professor at Indiana University. The last person I'm going to talk to, and I know my time is running out here, so this will in fact be the last person, I do know that, which is Harlow Shapley. Unfortunately, Irina's going to be talking more about Shapley because he does have a very important role in this. He was head of the Harvard Observatory. He probably had more run-ins with the Harvard University administration than anyone else did. And it also, talking about Shapley in this period also, I think, illustrates the next sort of stage of Harvard's reaction to its stance on displaced scholars. So I'm going to start by just reading you two things that Shapley wrote, just very short paragraphs, to give you a flavor for what it was like to get involved in this work. So Shapley writes, "God knows I would retreat from the nervous burden of worrying about academic refugees if my conscience would let me and anyone else would carry on. Anyone with academic connections and efficient machinery comparable with those at my disposal." So that's a very conscious acknowledgement of how being at Harvard put him in this position, and it was a responsibility he felt he had to bear. And it also came at the expense of doing what he loved in his research. He was an astronomer, and he wrote, "These refugee scholars, to be sure, take some of my time from the stars, but the stars will not be of much good to us if we do not preserve the minds with which to comprehend them." So 1939 becomes a critical year, and for sort of two different reasons. The first reason is that a lot of these people who had been getting these temporary grants and had the Emergency Committee and the Rockefeller Foundation fund them were running out. So universities were in a position of either having to get rid of these people or to pay the grants themselves, and they weren't too happy about it. It also began to be sort of, the word kind of went out that the United States had reached a saturation point for hiring refugee scholars, and some of this was actually coming from the George David Berkhoff, who was a mathematician at Harvard and head of and dean of the arts and sciences here. Wish I had time to talk about him, but I'm not going to. So he was one of the people pushing this. And so as a result of this, Shapley pushed Conant, the president of Harvard, along with Columbia's president, Nicholas Murray Butler, to start an endowment for 100 scholars who would get $2,000 each, and they could use research facilities at different universities all across the country, but they wouldn't teach, and therefore they would not be competing with American scholars. But Butler thought the money for this, which would have been was about $6 million, could come from being raised from rich Jews. The plan fizzled, largely due, the national plan did, to Conant's inattention. Shapley then tried to do the same thing at Harvard with a much smaller number of people. He was informed by the Harvard Corporation that he could do that as long as he raised the $150,000 that was needed all by himself. Turns out there were not enough rich Jews to go around. He started trying to tap into some of the emergency committees' funding sources. That was also a almost solely individual effort. They got very angry at him. They had disputes about it. And what ended up happening is there was a plan that was only at Harvard for 10 scholars, and some of it was money coming from the emergency committee, and some of it was from money that Shapley had already raised. At the same time this is going on, there's a sort of an even bigger and more serious problem which is the fact that in 1938 and 39, German aggression is meaning that there are more Jews being brought under Nazi control and more Jews losing their positions in various countries. So, of course, the annexation of Austria in March of 1938, and then all of the occupation of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939. There's also the Kristallnacht pogrom in November of 1938, which means any remaining Jews in Germany want to leave. So there's now an international refugee crisis. The FDR administration allowed the quotas to be filled in 1939 for the first and last time. That was the 1 year the quotas were filled. But there was a very long waiting list to get into the United States with quota numbers. So for scholars who have been trying both methods, trying to get a regular visa, trying to get a non-quota visa, the non-quota visa now presented their only opportunity. And some of the refugee organizations and some of the universities decided that they would try and give people an academic affiliation so they could get the non-quota visa, even if they weren't going to be paying necessarily their salaries. And this was particularly useful for medical scholars because they often had hospital affiliations, but that would be not enough to get them the non-quota visa. They also needed to have, for example, a Harvard Medical School kind of appointment. But this is the moment when James Conant decides that he is going to make it official Harvard Corporation policy that they are now only going to hire refugee scholars who are exceptional, world-class, and that only if Harvard is going to pay the entirety of their salary for the rest of their lives. So no effort at any kind of emergency. We understand what's happening. It's now we're only going to hire people in that category. And during this period, they turned down many people, including one Nobel laureate, and they turned down many people who end up not escaping Europe and dying, to be quite honest. And I am going to conclude now with one final example. And this goes back to Shapley. So one of the people that Shapley wanted to hire was a man named David Beloriski. And he was an assistant astronomer at the Marseille Observatory. He was a widower with a 3-year-old son. And in 1942, Shapley wrote to the Rockefeller Foundation about him. And remember, 1942 is a year when Jews are being deported from France to Auschwitz. And certainly the people in refugee work understood that. So Shapley writes to the Rockefeller Foundation, the racial laws that Hitler forced on France have thrown him out of his position, and during the past year, he has been in pretty desperate straits. The laws may get worse, and he may perish. And the Rockefeller Foundation agrees to put up the money to fund his salary, or at least half of it. Shapley wants to hire him at the observatory. But in October 1942, the central administration says that they cannot hire Beloriski. And at that point, a dejected Shapley scrawled a 1-sentence note for the files. At this point, the red tape and callousness of official Harvard stopped me. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I should have explained that the format of this will be to listen to all 3 papers and then field questions. So papers are 20 to 25 minutes in length. And then our second speaker is right here at the podium, Irina Mikhailova, whose talk, shall I go ahead and read the title? Harvard Astronomer and Refugee Philosophers on Harlow Shapley's,
On
Harlow Shapley's humanitarian efforts.
Thank you very much. So I'm a historian of philosophy, and I was primarily interested in a small group of philosophers who were on Shapley's list. So Harlow Shapley was a renowned astronomer who served as a director of Harvard College Observatory from 1921 to 1952. As a scientist, he revolutionized our view of the size of the Milky Way galaxy and reconsidered the solar system's position within it. As a political activist, deeply concerned with the present and future of his country and the entire human civilization, Shapley was, among others, an advocate of civil control over atomic energy, as well as contributed to the formation of UNESCO. Yet, Shapley was also a humanitarian who invested tremendous effort in rescuing European refugee scientists and scholars in the 1930s and 1940s. We might think that since Shapley was a passionate scientist, completely absorbed in an exploration of stars and galaxies, he would be primarily interested in bringing to Harvard European astronomers, physicists, or mathematicians to strengthen the relevant scientific departments at the university. However, Shapley's papers, which are located at Harvard University archives, demonstrate that he never treated people who were in perilous circumstances instrumentally and strived to help every person on his rescue list, regardless of the field of expertise, age, gender, or religion of the persecuted individual. Shapley's political stance and life principles were best expressed in his own words, quote, "I am exceedingly unhappy when I see injustice. I am a fellow traveler with all the minorities in turn when their constitutional rights are invaded by a thoughtless majority or by malicious aggressors." End quote. By the 1930s, Shapley already possessed an international scientific reputation for his work in astronomy and was well known in American political circles. When he engaged in rescuing European refugee scientists, his reputation, along with his stubbornness and inexhaustible energy, contributed to the success of his endeavors. For Jewish refugees who looked for an escape from totalitarian regimes, Shapley became, as he was called, the guardian angel. Richard Prager, a German Jewish exile astronomer, expressed it as follows, quote, "Every night, at least 1,000 Jewish scientists were saying a prayer of thanks for Harlow Shapley's humanitarian efforts, which had helped to save them and their families." End quote. Among Shapley's papers at Harvard, there are many touching letters of gratitude from these people. Yet, there are also upsetting letters and telegrams in this collection informing Shapley that it was too late to assist a refugee who either got imprisoned in concentration camp or died while desperately waiting for help in Europe. In November of 1938, once Shapley learned about the pogroms in Germany, he immediately understood that every Jewish or anti-totalitarian researcher who stayed in Europe at that time was at risk. From the very beginning, Shapley was horrified by the political developments in Nazi Germany, which he perceived as, quote, "decline of European civilization, a crisis which threatened the entire humanity." Shapley created a list of European scientists and scholars at risk who urgently needed assistance. In addition to this list, Shapley started to design a rescue plan for European displaced intellectuals that he discussed with presidents of American universities, first of all with Harvard President James Conant, professors from various departments at Harvard and beyond, political leaders, including the former president of the United States, Herbert Hoover, as well as representatives of the rescue organizations. He urged all of the participants of these discussions to consolidate efforts and launch a nationwide initiative of bringing displaced creative minds, as Shapley called European refugees, to this country and distribute them among the American universities. Astronomers' plan was generally welcomed in political and academic circles, but its implementation encountered essential difficulties. In the consequent years, Shapley's list has been steadily growing, but accommodating refugee scholars at American universities was proceeding rather slowly. In a letter to Herbert Hoover on the 5th of December 1938, Shapley suggested bringing about 100 scientists from Germany, Italy, and Austria as research associates or asylum fellows, subsidizing their stays at the American universities for a considerable term of years, if not for life. As the realization of this plan would require substantial financial resources, Shapley urged Hoover to discuss the possibility of financing it with Bernard Baruch and John Rockefeller. He commented on the money issue as follows, quote, the amount would, of course, be small compared with that necessary for a mass migration, but as an investment in civilization, it should be essentially more important, end quote. When writing to people in power, Shapley attempted to choose the right language to persuade them that bringing refugee scientists to this country would be beneficial for its flourishing. However, in the other, more personal letters addressed to his friends, Shapley demonstrated that he was purely altruistic in his motivation to help these people. Yet, in the process of tailoring his rescue plan, Shapley understood that, apart from a shortage of financial resources, there were political concerns which prevented the university administrations from accepting European refugees, most of whom were Jewish. In the letter to Henry Morgenthau, the United States Secretary of Treasury, from 13th of February 1939, Shapley admitted that there was no room in the academic market for European exiles, and that, quote, we all feel that if these salvaged scholars are not well distributed over the country, the movement is likely to foster anti-Semitism and anti-foreignism, end quote. At the same time, he demonstrated a strong willingness to search for a solution of this problem and continue his rescue campaign. To help refugees, he was ready to restrain his astronomical activities and completely focus on his humanitarian mission. Shapley was overwhelmed with the number of urgent requests he was receiving as the political situation in Europe was becoming more and more threatening. By the fall of 1939, after months of struggling for his nationwide rescue plan with no success, Shapley desperately wrote to Lewis Strauss, quote, the fishing out of men one by one, as you convince reluctant faculties to act, is certainly not a proper way to give effective help, end quote. Despite the financial, political, and administrative obstacles, Shapley continued to assist refugees individually using his networks and authority in the academic world. As I previously mentioned, Shapley's list included a small group of refugee philosophers, mainly Germans and Austrians, who had rather successful careers in Europe, but in the United States, their work in philosophy did not draw much attention. Among the philosophers on Shapley's list were Richard Kroner, Gotthard Günther, Edgar Zilsel, Erich Frank, and about 15 other people whose work today is slowly being brought out of the shadows. Shapley attempted to find an academic position for each of them and continuously inquired about their job situations. It was impossible to bring all of them to Harvard, naturally, but eventually Shapley managed to find jobs for almost every philosopher on his list. Richard Kroner came to the United States in early 1940 with the assistance of Otis Lee, professor of philosophy at Vassar College, who studied with Kroner from 1933 to 1934 in Kiel, in Germany. Kroner was offered the position of professor of philosophy at McGill University in Montreal, but once Hitler conquered France, Kroner was advised not to come to Canada due to anti-Germany hysteria, and the 56-year-old philosopher had to search for another job. His age was among the reasons for his candidacy being rejected by American colleges. Shapley followed Kroner's situation, and eventually, with the help of Paul Tillich, also a German exile philosopher and theologian, Kroner luckily was hired by the Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York. Gotthard Günther, a scholar of Hegel who came to the United States in 1940, as for the winter of 1942, still had no academic position and had to live in the refugee house. Shapley did his best to help the philosopher, but in addition to bureaucracy and lack of funding, Günther's unstable emotional state was among the reasons for experiencing difficulties in this country. In spring of 1942, after months of searching, Shapley and his colleagues would found the position for Günther at Colby College. However, in December of 1943, Günther was at the age of quitting his job and at the age of nervous breakdown. He was deeply dissatisfied with his working conditions and was depressed about being unable to bring his wife to this country. Robert Ulich, a professor of philosophy and education at Harvard, sadly reported to Shapley, quote, "My hope that after an appointment in such a fine environment as Colby College, Günther's emotional balance would be completely restored has seemingly not materialized," end quote. Shapley was deeply disappointed. In a critical letter to Günther, he reminded the German philosopher that once all the possible assistance was provided to him, it was in his power to move further. Unfortunately, not every refugee philosopher could cope with mental distress and adapt to the new social and academic environment. Due to his not too attractive personality, Austrian philosopher of science Edgar Zilsel, who emigrated to the United States in 1939, did not feel well American academic environment. In exile, he published a great number of works in sociology, history, and philosophy of science, and even was invited to teach at Mills College in California in 1943. A year later, unfortunately, at the age of 52, Edgar Zilsel committed suicide. Erich Frank, a German philosopher of religion and classicist, perhaps represents one of the most interesting cases from Shapley's list, since he was among a few German philosophers with whom Shapley developed a real friendship. In 1936, as a consequence of the Nuremberg laws, Erich Frank was dismissed from Marburg University, where he succeeded Martin Heidegger 10 years earlier. In May of 1939, Frank joined the Department of Philosophy at Harvard University as a research associate. This appointment was preceded by a 6-month bureaucratic correspondence between Shapley, the Emergency Committee, Oberlander Trust, and the Harvard administration. While waiting in Germany, Frank got into a concentration camp, but was soon released and left Germany. Even though Harvard was instrumental in bringing him to the United States, Frank was appointed without salary, which had to be retained from other sources. In the next years, Shapley had to perform bureaucratic tricks, persuade the Harvard administration to prolong Frank's affiliation every 6-12 months, meanwhile searching for a long-term appointment at other places for his philosophical friend, as he called him. Shapley was especially concerned about Frank, who had no family and the United States lived rather poorly. In the situations when Shapley believed Frank was treated unfairly, he always stood up for him. For example, in November 1942, Shapley happily reported to the Emergency Committee that Frank was invited to give the prestigious Flexner lectures at Bryn Mawr, while still conducting an advanced seminar in Greek philosophy. Yet, as soon seminar at on Greek philosophy at Harvard, sorry. Yet, as soon as the Emergency Committee learned about Frank's new source of income, they decided to cut his stipend off, since he would be getting too much money. Shapley was outraged. Quote, "It seems something like a penalty on him for distinction and good work," end quote. After emotional negotiations between Shapley and the Emergency Committee, Frank was allowed to retain his stipend. Shapley was deeply interested in religion and philosophy, but he seemed not to have found too many like-minded people among Harvard philosophers. Frank, in turn, was as good in philosophy and classics as in mathematics and physics. In his most important work published in Germany in 1923, Plato and the so-called Pythagoreans, Frank traced the development of the Greek mathematical scientific concept of the world up to the time of Aristotle and connected it with the rise of Greek philosophy and art. Frank followed the developments in physics and astronomy and contemplated the possibility of reconciliation between science and religion, a problem which puzzled Shapley as well. It's worth noting that Shapley was a regular participant in the meetings of American Philosophical Society and from the 1950s onwards of the Institute on Religion in an Age of Science. In a biographical memoir on Harlow Shapley, American-Dutch astronomer Bart Bok wrote, quote, "Historians of the future should not only take note of Harlow Shapley's great scientific achievements, but I hope that they will also remember him as a fine human being, as an independent, bold human spirit with a healthy distrust in all authority. He thought of our world as one large place with unnatural national boundaries, populated by hundreds of millions of basically kind and worthy people," end quote. Shapley's humanitarian efforts in the 1930s and 40s demonstrate how true these words are. I hope soon we will see more studies on this remarkable man, but I shall stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker will be Sebastian Musch, and he will be speaking on Werner Jaeger, on Greeks, Jews, and Germans.
Well, thank you very much, Irina, for inviting me to the panel, and Peter for introducing me. I will talk about one specific refugee scholar, and I will start with saying that few refugee scholars received as much attention and recognition as Werner Jaeger. Already a famed classicist in the 1920s, Jaeger was welcomed with open arms in the US, where he held several prestigious appointments before coming to Harvard in 1939. At the occasion of his appointment in March 1939, the Crimson noted, quote, "Known as one of the world's most eminent authorities in the field of ancient classics, Jaeger will hold one of the university professorships recently created by President Conant," Laurel mentioned him, "by which the holder is free to make his own teaching and research schedules and may teach in any department of the university." End of quote. He settled in Watertown in a, by all accounts, generous mansion until his death in 1961. And his accolades are too numerous to name, but they span the pre-war, the war, and the post-war period. So, who was Werner Jaeger? He was born in 1888 in the small German town of Lobberich, close to the Dutch border, to Protestant parents. Jaeger had excelled early in his school years and was already proficient in ancient Greek before he began his studies at the University of Marburg in Berlin, where his dissertation laid the foundation for his fame in the fields of classics. In his dissertation, Jaeger compellingly showed that Aristotle's Metaphysics was not a monolithic text, but rather a compilation that depicted the development in Aristotle's thinking. Besides his more specialized groundbreaking studies, Jaeger was and is today best known for his opus magnum Paideia, which was published in 3 volumes between 1934 and 1947. I actually brought the 3 volumes from the library. Even today, Paideia is still well known among students of ancient Greece. Beyond this, however, it's also part of German intellectual history, a context in which it is less often considered. And while I will not be able to argue this case in full detail today, I hope at least to highlight some aspects that warrant this point of view. So in Paideia, Jaeger aimed to show the development of the Greek educational concept of Paideia from its inception in archaic Greece to the pinnacle of its conceptual development in Plato's philosophy. As Jaeger stated in his foreword to the first volume of Paideia, his goal was not only to elucidate the pedagogy of the past, but also to carve out a perennial principle that could lead humanity to new heights, to the self-realization of its potential, and to usher in a new humanism, a third humanism, as he called it, after the humanism of the ancient world and the humanism of the Renaissance. This third humanism, despite its supposed perennial features and Jaeger's attempt to frame it as transcending its intellectual context, was rather obviously bound to its German context, Paideia thus owed much to the German concept of Bildung, as Jäger himself acknowledged. Quote, unser deutsches Wort Bildung bezeichnet das Wesen der Erziehung am anschaulichsten im griechischen platonischen Sinne. In English, our German word Bildung describes the essence of education most accurately in the Greek Platonic sense. Jäger saw a close connection between ancient Greece and Germany, starting with German classicism as the herald of a new era and ascribing to the German people a special role in the actualization of third humanism. Because he detected in Germany a, quote, lebende Antike, or living antiquity. On several occasions in Paideia, Jäger returned to Goethe, whom he attests a, quote, a mental attitude closely akin to the Greek, end of quote. So German classicism had elevated Greek arts to its status as the highest, most ideal form of art since Winckelmann's 1755 work, Thoughts on the Imitation of Greek Words in Painting and Sculpture, I spare you the long German title, and later others, most prominently Hölderlin, had looked to ancient Greece as an aesthetic model. Jäger, in a programmatic article called Die geistige Gegenwart der Antike from 1929, drew with a broad brush line from Winckelmann to the present. And in English, the line of development of our relationship to antiquity in Germany is Winckelmann, Goethe, Hölderlin, Nietzsche. It leads from the classicist ideal of form to cultural criticism. So as we can see, Jäger placed himself explicitly in the German intellectual tradition that looked to ancient Greece as a model. Additionally, Jäger was also part of the legacy of German Orientalism. In Paideia, he reproduced a dichotomy that we can find in many variations throughout the 19th and 20th century, from Romanticism onwards. Jäger wrote that, quote, Oriental nations are both racially, rassisch, and intellectually different from us, end of quote. Throughout Paideia, he uses the term Orient as a foil to highlight ancient Greece. He claims in Paideia that, quote, the Greeks constitute a fundamental advance on the great people of the Orient, a new stage in the development of society. They established an entirely new set of principles for communal life, end of quote. Jäger dismissively subsumed Jews and Judaism with the quote-unquote Oriental nations, and that is the Chinese, the Indians, Babylonians, and Egyptians for him, and concludes that, quote, none of these nations has a word or an ideal which corresponds to real culture, end of quote. And there are many more examples in that similar vein. So at the same time, Jäger also wanted to go further. He castigated the German classicists and their successors for their focus on arts, aesthetics, and later culture. Mostly he conceded this was because they were, quote, living in an unpolitical age, end of quote. While German classicism was to be lauded for its return to Greece, its merely aesthetic interest limited its impact. However, now this was a luxury it could not afford. Quote, we can no longer read or write histories of Greek literature in vacuo, cut off from society which produced it and to which it was addressed, he wrote in 1934. In that sense, Jäger saw his Paideia as an antithesis to German classicism. Quote, the man revealed in the work of the great Greeks is a political man. And as a consequence, any future humanism must be built on the fundamental fact of all Greek education. The fact that for Greek humanity always implied the essential quality of a human being, his political character, end of quote. So Jäger saw Paideia, his great intellectual project, as a political project as well, and subsequently took a dive into the muddy waters of politics. So as I mentioned, the first part of Paideia was published in 1934. Also, Jäger had been developing his ideas since at least 1929. So when the National Socialists came to power, Jäger, like many conservative-minded intellectuals, saw this as an opportunity to realize his ideas. And he thought to capitalize on his relationship with the philosopher and pedagogue Ernst Krieg. In the Weimar Republic, Krieg was relieved from his professorship in 1932 for his anti-democratic views. After Hitler came to power, Krieg's career went on an upswing. He founded the journal Volk im Werden as a forum for the pedagogical ideas of the new regime. During the 1930s, he was head of the University of Frankfurt and the University of Heidelberg, where he was also a professor in its famed philosophy department. Later, he was made an honorary SS Obersturmbannführer for his instrumental role in developing the pedagogical vision of the Nazi regime. Jäger published his article Die Erziehung des politischen Menschen und die Antike, The Education of the Political Man in Antiquity, in the third volume of Volk im Werden, in which he tried to square his ideas as laid out in Paideia with the nascent National Socialist philosophy of pedagogy. So, and it's possible to concede that this hastily written article from April 1933, so that's only 3 months after Hitler came to power, was less a product of conviction than the strategic attempt to test if Krieg might be an ally in turning Jäger's ideas of third humanism into praxis. However, after this initial test balloon, Jäger quickly realized the futility of his attempts to come to terms with the new regime. As Wolfgang Rössler has shown, Jäger considered the option of leaving Germany as early as the second half of 1933. And in a deliberate effort, he improved his English skills and thought to strengthen his ties to the universities abroad, especially in the US. In 1934, he spent half a year as a visiting professor at the University of California at Berkeley, during which period he first visited and lectured at Harvard. And while his position seemed to at least secure for the time being, we can certainly surmise that the anti-Semitic policies of the Nazi regime played a major role in his decision to leave Germany. In the meantime, several of his former students lost their positions because of their Jewish origin. His second wife, Ruth Heinitz, whom he had married in 1931, was, according to National Socialist race ideology, a quote-unquote half-Jew. Thus, Jäger was prescient enough to recognize the danger, and in fact, after leaving Germany in 1936, the Nazi regime passed a law in 1937 that relieved professors from their positions if married to someone considered non-Aryan. And that would have been the case for Jäger, of course. So in 1936, Jäger was appointed to the University of Chicago, where he stayed until coming to Harvard in 1939. While in Chicago, he published an article titled Greeks and Jews, the first Greek records of Jewish religion and civilization, in the Journal of Religion. And it was published in 1938. So in the 1920s and in Paideia, Jäger had been rather incurious about the role of Judaism in the ancient world. This can mostly be explained by the fact that the Greek text that Jäger was most interested in made no mention of Judaism at all. The few times he mentions Judaism or the Israelites in Paideia, they are subsumed under the umbrella Oriental, as I mentioned. So in 1938, Jäger again took a new look at Judaism. His Greeks and Jews article is clearly tinted by the contemporary context of the anti-Semitic persecution by the Nazi regime and the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism at this time in general. Lambasting the quote, the anti-Semitic tendencies of many later Greek and Roman writers, end of quote, he states that, quote, the relationship between Greeks and Jews makes one of the most interesting chapters in the history of Hellenism, end of quote. Even with this newfound appreciation, Jäger maintained the dichotomy that we already found in the opening pages of Paideia. Quote, they, that's the relationship between Greeks and Jews, form part of the larger problem of Orient and Occident, end of quote. So in this article from 1938, Jäger aimed to show how Greek authors thought of the Jews as, quote, a philosophical race, end of quote. And he identified the first mention of Judaism in Greek texts. And that's from Theophrastus, a pupil of Aristoteles and his successor as the leader of the Peripatetic school, which was credited with the first explicit mention of Jews in Hellenic texts. As Jäger explained in 1966, Jakob Bernays had identified several quotations from a lost book by Theophrastus in the writing of the Neoplatonist philosopher Porphyrius. Also, the exact book was lost. Theophrastus had been identified thus as the oldest Hellenic author mentioning Judaism through a much later written source. While Jäger was certain that monotheism had been the reason for Theophrastus' interest in Judaism, the quotes conveyed by Porphyrius focus on the custom of fire sacrifice of animals to God, which Theophrastus saw as indicative of the philosophical inclination of Judaism. Jakob Bernays in 1866 had claimed that Theophrastus had most likely received this information about Judaism orally from soldiers and merchants who had moved between the East and West in the aftermath of Alexander's conquest of large swaths of Inner Asia. However, Jäger contested the likelihood of this hypothesis. Instead, he argued that Theophrastus might have known another author's work, namely Hectaeus Aegyptiatica, an account of Egyptian history that included an excursion on Judaism and Jewish history, the first longer text in Hellenic literature on the subject, which is lost today and only known to us through extensive quotations by Diodorus. While Jäger could not prove that Theophrastus had relied on Hectaeus' excursion on Judaism and Aegyptiatica, he pointed out that Theophrastus quoted the Aegyptiatica twice in his book on minerals, making it likely this was also the source of his knowledge about Judaism. Thus, Jäger concluded that Theophrastus was in fact not the first Hellenic writer who mentioned Judaism, but rather Hectaeus. So this is a very simple synopsis of a rather intricate argumentation by Jäger that I cannot give full justice to. The question is rather why, besides a philological interest in textual priority, is the first mention of Judaism so important to Jäger? And I will try to answer that in the remainder of my time. As Jäger went on to explain, what Hectaeus was most interested in was the question of the ideal state, a staple of Greek writing which finds its most prominent expression in Plato's Politeia. Hectaeus views the Jews as particularly philosophically inclined. He's after all the source of Theophrastus' designation of the Jews as a quote-unquote philosophical race. And the Greek word for a race is here genos. For Hectaeus, according to Jäger, the Jewish ban on idolatry and the abstract nature of their worships are signs of this philosophical inclination, which also finds its expression in Jewish legislation and political formation. That is, the question of the ideal state. In the laws given to the Israelites by Moses, Hectaeus detected an ideal with a striking similarity to Plato's ideal state in Politeia, with Moses as a quasi-philosopher king. What Jäger himself found particularly notable and crucial for his undertaking to reconstruct the concept of paideia is Hectaeus' focus on the educational scheme derived from the divine laws of this philosophical race, quote unquote. Moses' legislation encourages endurance, bravery, self-discipline, he writes, while wisdom is delegated to the priestly caste as a stand-in for Plato's philosopher government. Thus, Jäger argued, Hectaeus found an approximation to paideia in Judaism. So in Paideia, Jäger had written that, quote, the laws and prophets of the Israelites, the Confucian system of the Chinese, the Dharma of the Indians, are in their whole intellectual structure fundamentally and essentially different from the Greek ideal of culture. Well, what a difference 4 years can make. Between 1934 and 1938, Jäger found his key witness, Hectaeus, incidentally the first Greek to mention Judaism, who had put Judaism at least in loose association with the vaunted Greek philosophical tradition and paideia. In 1934, Jäger had written, der Grieche ist der Philosoph unter den Völkern. The Greek is the philosopher among the nations. Now, in 1938, the Greek's philosophical acumen also reflected well on the Jews. Jäger's sudden discovery that the Jews were considered a quote-unquote philosophical race in ancient Greece can seem a bit opportunistic, and it certainly was. And as we have seen, Jäger saw his reconstruction of paideia as a political project. But his brief attempt to seek influence over National Socialist educational policy seemed to have cured him of a too open application of his ideas to the political realm. Still, as I've tried to show, political considerations lingered on in his writing, albeit more subtly. In a note to his article mentioned before, The Education of the Political Man in Antiquity, Jäger's biography during his transition between Germany and the US, in that sense, also represents the education of a political man. Thanks.
Thank you very much. These are three fascinating papers on a very troubling but fascinating period, which of course has some resonance today. Of course. Are there questions? Please, I'll field questions. Yes, sir.
Yes, one thing I liked that you did, Professor Leff, was that you actually have quantitative numbers, because I remember when I came here as a graduate student in history, we were always taught to read The Intellectual Migration by Balin and Donald Fleming edited book, and people who criticized the book said there's no numbers, no data, and that's how things were done. So it was interesting to me that you pointed out that Harvard brought 45 refugee scholars under Conant. And you mentioned that Etzel, the dean at the medical school, brought 5 people. And I guess the way I would like to pose this question is, I read this piece by Professor Gordon, Professor Egonet's colleague, James Hankins, who's really attacking Penny Pritzker. But he points out that the medical school has 12,000 faculty across that whole complex. Faculty of Arts and Sciences is around 1,100 people. So I guess what I would want to say, I have a little bit of odd sympathy for the administrators who are afraid for people to come, because Harvard had so few administrators. Even when Derek Bach came, he said he only had 1 vice president, no provost. He quickly hired 6 vice presidents. Now we have 13, actually 16 VPs if you do the thing, and we have a provost. In other words, some of these universities were run with tiny administrations. So it was very hard, I think, for the administrators. But I guess what I want to ask is, what was the problem with the medical school, where I don't know what the size of it was in the 1930s, but Hankins says almost half of the medical doctors in the greater Boston area have a faculty appointment at Harvard-connected hospitals. And so, I just find it pretty astonishing that this vast medical industrial complex, maybe it wasn't so big then, could only find room for 5 people.
Well, that was only during 2 years, so that was 33 to 35. There were some people hired after that, although I probably not in very great numbers. I mean, I should say about the numbers that it's kind of hard to come up with them, and there isn't sort of one file where this all is. I mean, so even in trying to find the number of people who were hired during Etzel's time in the medical school, you had to look at lots of individual files. And so there'd be so it's organized by here are all the people who applied, but you don't know who actually got the position. So it's not very easy to do. In terms of the numbers, I mean, I would think they probably did not have as large a network of professors and or people associated with the medical school. On the other hand, I mean, especially in this 1939-40 period, where you really do have some hospitals being willing to hire people, but all they need is someone, the Harvard, to give them affiliation in order to at least qualify for the non-quota visa. I mean, it doesn't mean they were necessarily going to get them. And in the same way the State Department was terrible about granting regular visas, they actually tended to be pretty terrible about granting non-quota visas too. But I think that was more, I mean, I think that's more reflection, and this is partially what Irina talked about too, was the not wanting to make this humanitarian. Someone like Shapley did, someone like Etzel did, someone I think to a less extent like Friedrich did, not wholly, right? Even in all 3 of those cases, I mean, the title of my book is Well Worth Saving. You couldn't say everybody, you had to decide who you were going to save, but was the attitude, I want to save these people, I understand what they're going through, or was the attitude, I'm Harvard, we have standards, and that's what matters most? And I think that was sort of the tension between the administration and the faculty who cared, and of course most faculty didn't care, but that probably goes without saying.
Please, yes.
I want to bring the French refugees into the discussion. I was impressed by all the presentations. And I would like to ask, as a general question, and I'm sorry if this falls outside the scope of the discussion, if by the time the French refugees came in 1940 or 41, because they left occupied France because they were Jewish or communist or both, if the atmosphere and the attitude of American academia had changed, if that double bind you explained so well had maybe morphed into a more welcoming attitude.
France was a different case, as you kind of indicated. So
And the war had started.
Well, the war had started, no, but also just, I mean, in terms of the intellectual migration as well. The Roosevelt administration, under pressure, decided that they were going to identify 2,000 people who in France, some of them were French, some of them had been people who had come from Germany or Austria earlier and were now in France. And if they were of exceptional quality, a very loaded term, obviously, then they could get emergency visitors visas. So this was not part of the immigration. These would be temporary. And that did, in fact, set, I mean, a whole new committee, also called an emergency committee. They're all emergency committees. The Emergency Rescue Committee was started to identify who these 2,000 people were. There was a State Department list that was put together. So it was a somewhat different dynamic. But the Rockefeller Foundation sort of went into high gear about this. I mean, they felt as if at this moment Western civilization was endangered, even more so than when the Nazis first took power. That probably France was going to fall. I mean, France had already fallen. Probably Great Britain was also going to fall. And so if you were going to save literally Western civilization, you had to get those people out of France. But you still had a State Department who was very, I mean, so on one hand, you have more of an effort on the part, at least of some parts of the American academic community, but you have, ironically maybe, even more resistance on the part of the State Department in terms of giving people visas. So even though, I mean, they had places for 2,000, I mean, that was sort of the number, it was fewer than that, and it was mostly because the State Department wouldn't, I mean, they still had control over whether you got these temporary visas too. So it's an interesting, I mean, there is absolutely in the academic community a recognition of this is really the precipitous moment.
But there's only so many positions.
Then there are only so, and then this is also, as I talked about, this is the moment where American universities started saying we're at a saturation point. If we admit more refugees, there's going to be a backlash, and it's going to give rise to anti-Semitism. So you're getting, I mean, the people who are advocates understand the moment, but the more and sort of widespread concern is going in the other direction. I don't know if that answers what you were looking for, but.
Sir.
Yeah, I imagine that these refugees, even in the best circumstances, found it hard to adapt themselves to the American culture. I wonder how many of those were invited and decided to go back to their countries of origin after the war.
Thank you for your question. I think many of German scholars, at least, I know more about German philosophers, historians, sociologists. Many of them actually went back to Germany once they had a chance to do so. Some of them stayed, and we know quite famous examples of philosophers who stayed in the United States, and also historians, but I don't know in terms of numbers, but yeah, so people preferred to go back home, I think most of them, when the positions were available, of course, in Germany. Yeah.
Anyone else want to chime in?
I'm not sure it was most, is all I would say. I mean, some certainly did, and and some of the difference might be if you were German or, I mean, Jewish or non-Aryan or, so, I mean, at least from what I can tell, and the numbers on this, I mean, that was a good question that you asked about, and the numbers is not easy to come by because it really is mostly in individual files as opposed to all pulled together, so it's a little bit anecdotal. So you think of the people Shapley helped, most of them went back?
Many of them,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
For Leventhal.
I know that British universities were a little more generous in taking, particularly London School of Economics and the University of Manchester, with scientists and social scientists. And most of those were Jewish. Now, the question I have, though, is there were academic refugees who were not. And you have to wonder how much anti-Semitism plays in it. I mean, Werner Jaeger is not Jewish. Obviously has an easy time getting several positions in the United States. I think also of Hayo Holborn at Yale, who had some difficulties for a couple of years and was actually at LSE for a while, and then moved into a professorship at Yale, where he remained for the rest of his career. He was not Jewish, although his wife was. So, in your work, how big a part does anti-Semitism play in the placement of refugee scholars? I mean, can one differentiate and say that non-Jewish refugees had an easy time, Jewish refugees did not?
Yeah, I think it's too much to say an easy time, but certainly there's a big difference. Although, interestingly, in the American context, the question was not, are you Jewish or non-Aryan or Protestant or some other, but were you too Jewish? That was a phrase that was used all of the time. And so and you saw a little bit in what I mentioned, so the question about, is someone from a family that converted, or did they convert, or how Jewish do they seem? That almost seemed to be more important than their actual lineage, meaning, did they seem like they were Jews? Either they looked like they were Jews. I mean, you also saw that in Conant's reference to Max Bergman and his appearing Jewish. So that it's like, if you could pass, that is very helpful. So, but the discussion among American academics about how Jewish the applicants were is a dominant thing. Absolutely. Absolutely dominant. And I do think it was probably easier if you fell into the politically suspect category as opposed to into the you're Jewish or you're non-Aryan, which were actually two different categories, even though it seems like they'd be the same thing. Did you?
Well, if I could, I'll jump in here with a question. One thing that strikes me as interesting, hearing all three presentations, is, well, you know, we were treated to a marvelous overview from Professor Leff, and then really two particular cases, the discussion of Harlow Shapley, and who assisted so much, and then the case of Werner Jaeger, who himself was a refugee, but the difference between Shapley and Jaeger is, of course, vast, but one important difference that may have played a role here, and I'd be interested in your views on this, is the difference between the natural sciences and the humanities. Mm-hmm. And the reason why this interests me is that it's certainly very common to say that the humanities, along with the social sciences, are more imprinted by culture, and therefore scholars who work in those disciplines carry cultural habits, cultural biases. They wear their own national habitus, and in a way cannot shrug it off terribly easily. Whereas in the case of the natural sciences, we think that a scholar can simply migrate and that they embody a certain objectivity or universalism in their attitudes. The reason why this occurs to me is this very touching pathos-filled quote that I think Professor Leff mentioned at the end from Harold Shapley, where he said, "What good will it be, you know, for if the stars are still there, if there are no scholars to study them?" That embodies a certain idea of objectivity. I'm just curious, particularly in the comparison of the two cases here, whether we think there's a difference in the reception of refugee scholars when they were natural scientists or whether they were in the humanities.
I can talk a bit more. Yeah. I mean, like, Jaeger obviously became a rather powerful figure in the university once he was here. He was a university professor, right? and he was also the head of the Institute for Classical Studies here. So he's not well known for having assisted other refugee scholars. That was something that you can find in the few texts on his years here at the university in Harvard. And he was criticized for that by other refugees, that he did not use his influence to help other people to come to Harvard. Now, I actually found at the Harvard University archive several letters he wrote to the emergency committee, where he provided what I think are like character references, where he would write letters on, I don't know, he would describe the character, the personality, but also like the chance of employment in the US. And some of them were rather positive, some of them were like rather negative, and basically saying he's coming from a German university, doesn't know English, he's not going to fit in the academic culture here with his background. So I don't know what happened to these cases, but I assume a negative reference from Werner Jäger did not help. But I mean, like, so that touches at the question that Peter asked. Jäger noted that some of his former colleagues from Germany wouldn't fit in with the academic culture. So.
And you could see in some of those letters where, I mean, you're trying to be an academic and give an honest academic assessment of someone's work. On the other hand, you also know the stakes. And some people just, didn't care, right? So it was just all guns. If they didn't think the person was qualified, they would say it. Where other people, you could see they're trying to phrase it in such a way that they're not completely and literally dooming the person, right? In doing this work, it always struck me that how some people just went into their academic mindset, and the same kind of, discussion, well, their work is mediocre, they don't have enough publications, or their publications aren't as good, and they're getting letters, as you indicated, I think very meaningfully, literally saying someone's in a concentration camp, someone has been deported to a ghetto in Poland, and they usually had the addresses of the people in the ghettos in Poland, and yet they're still engaging in that kind of discussion. And as somebody else, you couldn't save everyone, but it still is very chilling to hear those kind of conversations going on, knowing the stakes.
Yeah, for sure. I think there was a difference between natural sciences and the humanities and social sciences. I think that I have an impression that it was still easier for scientists, for the refugee scientists, especially mathematicians or physicists, to find a job or academic position in the United States. Because mathematicians, it's also a problem of language, as you said, because mathematicians speak the language of mathematics, right? So you don't need to be to know English very well to start working in mathematics. But in case of the humanities, it is a problem. For instance, I mentioned Gotthard Günther. He had very unconventional trajectory of exile. He went first to Italy, but then he went to South Africa. And he couldn't teach there because he didn't know Afrikaans. So he didn't know the language, actually, at the university. So, and eventually he moved to the United States, and again he had the language. He had language problem, and another problem also was the difference between the philosophical traditions, right? So many of people I mentioned, they were trained in the continental philosophy, so they represented this continental philosophical tradition, which was not very welcomed here, where the analytic tradition of philosophy prevailed. So they didn't find common language with the local philosophers. Let's say. Not in all cases, but at least people I mentioned felt kind of isolated So they all mentioned this, that they felt this isolation. Yeah.
Fascinating, thank you.
The only thing I'd say just really quickly, and this I think is contrary to what most people assume, is that the Emergency Committee and the Rockefeller Foundation gave out more grants to people in the humanities and social sciences than they did in the sciences. Now, that may be, they were just getting more of those applications, but it wasn't, I mean, and people, and I noticed this in your talk as well, you know, they get fired from their jobs in 1933 or 34, and they decide a really smart thing to do now is learn English in my free time. And so a lot of them, I mean, some did, in fact, try to brush up on those kind of skills so they had a better chance of emigrating,
Yeah.
whether it was to Great Britain or to South Africa or to Australia.
Thank you. There's one more question in the back. Yeah.
So thank you, and a very illuminating panel for you, Laurel. I was interesting, how did the students react? So from the comic students, so you said before that in Germany they were like, sort of like almost pushing to get rid of the Jews.
They were, yeah.
Yeah, I know the infamous burning of the books in Berlin. That was actually done by the students' organization. So how did in the States?
You know, that's a wonderful question, and I don't really know the answer to it because it's not part of the files. So, you know, there's a little bit of grumbling sometimes, especially around the language issues. You see, you know, when a professor is up for renewal, you might get some of that, or there was some, I mean, there's also a big difference in the teaching in Germany and the teaching in the United States, and the role of the professor is much more formal and distant in Germany, at least it used to be, I don't know if it still is. And so there's some kind of complaining about that, but there, you don't, there wasn't sort of like, how dare you have these foreign professors in front. And one just example that I really loved was that there was one professor who did African American music or African music, and he was going to teach a class on that at Northwestern, and they couldn't get him out, and that the class was like oversubscribed, and the students were disappointed. I mean, that's kind of the only example of that I know of. But I think it's a really good question.
Thank you. There's one last question I'd like to ask, if you don't mind, and it's potentially an explosive one, but I hope not. But it's just because we're, you know, the panel had the very provocative title, Refugees Not Welcome. And it does raise a question about Harvard and about all universities and their, how welcoming they are to refugee scholars today. And if anybody on the panel feels that they want to speak to this issue, whether it's about Harvard or other universities, you're welcome to. There is, of course, at Harvard, the Scholars at Risk program, which I believe does some very good work. But of course, it remains a matter of controversy, and of course, in American political culture today, the question of whether to welcome refugees or migrants at all is a hot button issue, to say the least.
And that group is actually an extension of the Emergency Committee. The group that had originally started the Emergency Committee is the one.
Is the Scholars?
Yeah, there is a direct connection. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Okay. Yeah.
I think like in 70 years somebody will analyze Harvard University today, and I wonder like how our views are gonna be.
Of course, a delicate matter. You don't have comments, it's all right.
I can only comment on German university responses now to, I mean, like, I can just say now that in Germany, at least, there are a lot of programs for refugee scholars, first from Syria and now from Ukraine, and they all reference the difficulties that scholars who fled Nazi Germany faced when trying to find a position abroad. So, in a sense, this is interesting.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that today the American universities are more open in this respect compared to the 1930s and 40s. And the immigration rules are better, so improved these days. and Europe for sure. I know that many German, Austrian universities, also French, Italian, they hired many scholars at risk. Relatively many. I don't know the numbers, and I know that the European Commission established special programs of support for scholars at risk, particularly Ukrainian scholars. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, all three of the panelists, for a fascinating discussion. Please join me in thanking
And thank you to Irina for coming up with this really special thank you.
especially for Irina for